Boys, welcome back to another Bokosi's YouTube video. Today we got our top 24 running backs for week 16, the semifinals of the fantasy playoffs.
And boys, before we get into it, check out our SOBET. On our SOBET, every single primetime game we post our start, sit, and sleeper. We have our waiver wire top 10 targets on there. We post our weekly starts and sits on there. Love for you guys to join our awesome community. You also get the content of 25 plus other creators. Love for you to join us over on SOBET.
RB number one has to be number one. Derrick Henry. He absolutely owns the Texans every time. He destroys them. Yeah, he just has to be RB1 this week.
And next up at RB2, we got Austin Eckler. A very good matchup against the Colts. Dalvin Cook just put up over 25 fantasy points against him. Austin Eckler wasn't amazing last week, but has been amazing all season. Still a great RB option.
Next up, last player in this tier, CMC. He has been phenomenal with Brock Purdy. He has been insane since being traded to the Niners. It is the toughest matchup yet, though, against Washington, who are super good against running backs, but still has to be an elite RB1.
Next up, first player in our RB1 tier is Josh Jacobs. Had a terrible matchup last week. Did decent, got good rushing yards, but didn't have an amazing fantasy day. This week, another mid matchup. Steelers aren't great, but aren't horrible. It's Josh Jacobs, though. He's been balling all year.
Next up, Saquon Barkley balled out in the must-win game against Washington. I believe he had around 18 fantasy points this week against the Vikings. They have struggled on defense. They have not been amazing. Saquon could have another big day.
And next up at RB6, we got Dalvin Cook. He had a rough stretch of matchups for a little bit. Was averaging like under 15 points last week. Finally had a good matchup. What'd he do? 27 points against the Colts. The Giants are like right in the middle, kind of a mid matchup. Not too hard, not too terrible. Dalvin Cook should have a good game.
Next up, Kenneth Walker was actually pretty solid in what was an awful matchup against the Niners. Had over 10 fantasy points. Doesn't sound amazing, but again, the Niners have been phenomenal against running backs. He is pretty good upside this week.
Next up at RB8, we got Travis Etienne. Last week, a tough matchup, but still had good rush yards, had a couple catches finally, had a decent fantasy day. This game against the Jets, again, another mid matchup. He has a good start.
Next up, James Conner has been a pure workhorse for the Cardinals. He has been so good for fantasy. Even with Kyler down, he has been really good. It's just the matchup this week is so bad. The Buccaneers obviously super good against running backs. So the upside is not sky high, but still is a pretty safe floor.
Next up, we got Ramondre Stevenson. Ramondre Stevenson, last week, we were a little bit iffy on him. We don't know what the Patriots would do. He was questionable going into the game. He still put up over 20 fantasy points. He didn't start the game, but he finished very great. Obviously, they crumbled at the end of the game. Ramondre Stevenson, though, still put up an amazing performance.
Next up, we got Alvin Kamara. Last week, we were really hoping for a big game. He wasn't horrible. It was around, I believe, 12-ish fantasy points. Not as good as we were hoping for, but at least better than what he has been, because he has been so bad before that. But again, another good matchup against the Browns. Hopefully, he can finally have a good performance.
And our last player in this tier, we got Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones, another mid matchup. Miami Dolphins not super elite against RBs, not super terrible. Aaron Jones last week, though, A.J. Dillon did go down with a concussion. He had a pretty good game, got that receiving touchdown. A.J. Dillon should be cleared, though. They're still going to be in a committee. Still like Aaron Jones' upside, though.
Next up, Nick Chubb. He has not been good since Deshaun Watson took over as the quarterback. He has not had 10 points, not one game in 3 games with 10 or more points. It has been pretty bad, and it's a tough matchup against the Saints. He still has to be started because of the upside, but yeah, don't love the upside.
Next up, at RB14, we have David Montgomery. David Montgomery last week balled out over 24 fantasy points, had I think 2 touchdowns, an amazing game. One thing against him though, Khalil Herbert is off IR. He should be playing. Herbert is going to take some snaps. Montgomery with Herbert in this offense wasn't amazing earlier in the year. He's still startable, but he should be worse than he was last week.
And next up, Joe Mixon. We had him as a sit last week against the Bucs, and he had around 10 points. This week, the matchup might be even worse against the Patriots in New England. Again, don't love the upside here.
Next up at RB16, we have Najee Harris. Najee, he's been looking decent. A couple weeks ago, had an explosion game, but then Jalen Warren came back. He's back to not playing on third downs. Warren had a rushing touchdown last week, which is a bit concerning for Najee Harris. The matchup is pretty good against the Raiders, but the upside just is not super high.
I'm just going to group these next 2 guys together. We got Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott. Both guys basically completely splitting, and they're playing the Eagles. And if there's one thing the Eagles aren't elite at, it's stopping running backs. Basically, their team is insane. Just they've kind of struggled at times against running backs, which gives upside to both Zeke and Pollard.
First player in this next tier, maybe he should be higher, but we got Jerick McKinnon. Jerick McKinnon, the RB1 each of the past 2 weeks, absolutely cooking recently, but I think he wouldn't have done as amazing last week if Pacheco didn't fumble. Pacheco fumbled in like the second quarter. They benched him for basically the whole game. I think this week, Pacheco comes back, has at least some of his role. McKinnon has been too good to be behind Pacheco, but he isn't super high on our rankings.
Next up, we got Leonard Fournette, finally starting to take over the backfield a little bit more. They were kind of splitting him and White there for a bit, but White played, I believe, under 40% of snaps. Fournette has taken over, and it's a pretty solid matchup against the Cardinals.
Next up, we have Miles Sanders in a super tough matchup against this Cowboys defense. Miles Sanders gets even worse if Jalen Hurts doesn't play. Again, Hurts takes some touchdowns, but he puts the Eagles in so many scoring opportunities. Miles Sanders has way more touchdowns now than he does last year. Eagles offense has been quite good. Gardner Minshew's in though. I don't know how much scoring will happen. Maybe some more throwing. Don't love the upside of Miles Sanders.
Next up, we got J.K. Dobbins. He has been awesome recently. Last 2 games, each game over 100 rushing yards, and that's without Lamar. Assuming Lamar won't go, but if Lamar can somehow go, makes Dobbins even better, just that extra threat of running with Lamar. And again, it's a great matchup against the Falcons.
At RB23, first RB in this last year is Raheem Mostert. Raheem Mostert last week had a really nice run, was actually looking really good in this Dolphins backfield. If Jeff Wilson doesn't go and is is injured once again, Raheem Mostert moves up this for sure. But if Jeff Wilson plays, they're going to have a bit of a split. The matchup is pretty good against Green Bay. They're not amazing against RBs, but Mostert might be in a split backfield.
And last running back, never expected to see him on here, but it was due to an unfortunate injury. We got Zach Moss. Again, unfortunately, Jonathan Taylor is out for the season. Zach Moss took over last week. Took over even Deion Jackson. Deion Jackson had less of a role than Zach Moss did. It's a pretty good matchup against the Chargers, who have struggled against running backs.
And boys, thanks so much for watching the video. Again, check out our SOBET. I forgot to mention earlier in the video, the first 50 people that use code BROS when signing up will get the first month completely free. So much extra stuff on there. Love you guys to be a part of that. Thanks again for watching. See you guys next time.